So if you've been making 3D art for any amount of time and baking normal maps, of course, you've come across our old friend skewing. What skewing is that error you see when you've got a bolt or like a hole or something on your high poly mesh. And when you bake it down to the low poly, it looks distorted, or it looks like somebody's kind of grabbed it and they've smeared it to the side, or it's got some other kind of weirdness to it that makes it look wrong. That's skewing. And it's something that really trips up new artists when they start baking normal maps for the first time, because without the understanding of what's going on behind the scenes during the bake process, you don't stand much of a chance of fixing it, except through blind luck, or somebody taking your mesh and just fixing it for you, or whatever. The solution boils down to your projection, basically. And we're going to talk about that, how to get the best results, and hopefully help you avoid this in the future. So to demonstrate what the problem actually is, let's look at a simple baking example. So here I've got a high poly mesh. It's got some curves on these edges, and it's got a bunch of floating detail, these bolts that are kind of just hovering above the surface. The bolts have an indent, and then the bolt lives inside the indent. This is the kind of thing you really need a straight projection for, or else it looks goofy, right? And this is the low poly mesh we're going to bake it onto. Simple, straightforward geometry. But it will demonstrate skewing for us, which is its entire purpose in life. So I've got a normal map assigned to this already, but it's not baked. So we're going to bake this out real quick. Actually, hold on. First thing I'm going to do is just create the cage for this. We could probably get away with just using a distance, but I really prefer cages because they offer much more control, at least in my experience. But you can bake whichever way you bake. This should all be relevant. Okay, so I've got my cage, and I'm going to bake this out. So use my cage and go. Now you'll see when this gets done. Okay. And done. So if I hop back in here now and I isolate the low poly, now we can get in close, and this is skewing. See, you were expecting a nice straight bolt, but what you got was something that looks like it's been smeared. And up top, these bolts are kind of skewing toward the middle. You can see they're kind of tilted. The ones in the middle look all right. I can live with those ones. Those are pretty clean. But the ones on this far side are really slanted and pulling inwards. So why is that? Well, the answer to that question lies in your vertex normals, or smoothing on your low poly, or however you want to talk about it. So let me turn on the vertex normals here, and we can see what this looks like. So turning that on, we can get a good look at how the normals are being computed. So the way to think about this is, let's grab these three edges here, or this top polygon, because this is the worst offender we have, right? So looking at these vertex normals, you see, they start off kind of over here, and they end up kind of over here, right? So when the normal map baker is casting rays down to the high poly mesh to determine what to bake, it's interpolating from this angle across to this angle. So that makes sense, right? You see on the left hand side we're like this, and we had some skewing. On the right hand side we're like this, and we had some skewing. But the middle interpolation would be pretty much straight up and down, and we had no skewing in the middle. So that's how vertex normals are contributing to the skewing problem you're having. Now, how you generate your vertex normals is really entirely up to you. I recommend using an area weighting algorithm. Like in Modo, you can use the vertex normal toolkit, like you see is all set up down here in my bottom corner. There's a script for 3ds Max that'll do it, and so on. You don't have to do it, but I find that it helps a lot with vertex normals. And I'll just give a fast demonstration here. So if I turn off area weighting. You see what just happened? That's with it on. Watch my vertex normals. That's with it off. So when it's off, what's happening is that it's taking the two faces that contribute to that vertex normal and averaging their normals together and saying that's your vertex normal right there. And while that's mathematically accurate, that leads to some pretty vicious skewing. Like, look at those two extreme angles, right? But with area weighting, what's happening is that the larger faces are getting more importance given to them. So you can see here that these two faces, this face is big on top and this face is smaller down here. So the vertex normal that's generated is more upright than it would be normally. Now, it didn't fix our skewing here, but the skewing would be worse without it. And there's other benefits like getting nicer edge highlights and things like that. So look into it. But getting back to our vertex skewing, let's look at how we can address this specific case. Okay, so to fix the skewing, we have to fix the vertex normals that are being used to interpolate across the mesh. Now, one way we can do that is we can grab these edges and let me turn off the normal map so this is clearer. And we could add a bevel, like a one level bevel, just like this. You don't have to rhyme, but it helps, it's funnier. And with that edge bevel in there, if I recompute the normals, now you can see we have a much straighter projection here and a much straighter projection here because that bevel is taking the brunt of the transition between the normals. So with this in mind, you can see that the UVs are all okay because Pimoto just fixed that for us. That's good. So I'm going to, just for demonstration purposes, regenerate my cage. I do find that whenever you change your vertex normals, you do need to regenerate your cage. It sometimes tries to interpolate and do it for you, but it doesn't always do a good job. So if you are a cage baker, I would definitely recommend you regenerate. So with that done and that done, I'm going to go ahead, turn the normal map back on and bake it. And that'll take a second and we're done. Hop out. And now here's our low poly. And you can see by adding that bevel, we fixed, not entirely, but it's much better. These are way straighter than they were before. The middle's still fine, and these don't. These have a little bit of that skew that they had, but not entirely. So that's one solution. You can add bevels and stuff to the edges that surround your skewing, but it's not the best method in my opinion because you're adding geometry to the mesh and it just gets a little heavy sometimes. So let's look at an alternate way. Now the alternate way is very similar, except we're going to be adding some edge loops, not adding bevels. So since the projection error happens across the screws, I'm going to add an edge loop that hits the center of my screws to the low poly mesh. And I'm going to do the same to this side. And I'm going to do the same to our slanted piece here. I'm going to put an edge loop here that kind of rides through the center of there. And to be most correct, I should probably add some lengthwise edge loops as well. But we'll talk about that if it's necessary. All right, so if I select these, and again, turn on the vertex normals and recompute them, now you can see, oh, hold on, lost my edge loop here. Let me put that back, recompute, turn them back on, okay. Yes, so you can see now that we start off with our usual skew to the side, but then by the time it gets to the middle of our screws, we're already vertical. And then the same thing over here. So it gets vertical quickly right here, carries on vertically till it gets to here, and then begins to interpolate off to the corner. And on our slanted edge, we have a pretty vicious slant here, but by the time it gets to the screw, it's vertical, and then it begins to skew off. Now this should fix a good chunk of the skewing, because we're basically taking command of the vertex normals, right? So let me do my usual stuff here where I recreate my cage and all that. Good. That's the old normal map. We'll just bake on top of that. And let's bake this out and see what it looks like. And boom. All right. So killing that and zooming in, now you can see the skewing is all but gone, because we took command of those vertex and we added these edge loops that ran through the problem areas to tell the projection how to behave, basically. And so now the skewing is gone. And that's not the only solution to this. I mean, you can do fancy cuts where you end up, adding a vertex into the center of each bolt and that kind of thing. But this I felt was the simplest demonstration. So, but hopefully that'll spark your imagination where you can start to think about why things are happening. You know what I mean? Next up, we're going to talk about something that might get me in trouble, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Okay, so the slightly controversial thing is that you can now start to delete that supporting geometry if you're careful. There are those that say never do that. I'm sort of the opinion that if it looks fine, just go with it. So essentially what we're doing here is you add geometry to help the projection, to fix the projection. And then afterwards you can delete that geometry out so your low poly doesn't have to be any heavier than it needs to be. Now granted, with computers these days, a few extra edge loops is really not going to hurt anything, but for the sake of being as optimal as possible, we'll talk about this real quick. So the way you do it, obviously, is just you select the edge loop and delete it. Now if you look carefully there, and it does show up in the video, I think, the surface shading changed a little bit, because there's a normal map that's applied to this mesh now. And so now, effectively, I've broken the rules, because the low poly mesh vertex normals are supposed to always stay the same as what you baked with, because that's what the normal map was created for. It's a symbiotic relationship. But depending on your mesh, depending on what it's being used for, you can sometimes get rid of those loops. Now luckily we have a situation here where it doesn't work that well, and that's on our slanted face. So you can see here that if I turn off this, that smoothing looks fine on that face. But if I delete that edge loop, now I'm not sure if you can see it, but the smoothing has gone wacky on me. And that's not something you're going to want to live with. So you're going to want to leave that edge loop in. So it's a judgment call. There are people who are going to yell at me for this, I'm sure, but I thought I would bring it up because sometimes it really does help to be able to knock those loops out again. So yeah, use at your own discretion. So that's about it for normal map skewing. That's obviously not the whole topic, but hopefully that gives you enough information that you can go ahead and combat it when it happens to you. It's not a hard fix, but you do need to have that foundational knowledge of the vertex normals and what's going on sort of within the baker. So take that knowledge and go forth and be skew free. See you next time.